There is no denying for this city, for this roster, for this locker room, and for this time, Dan Campbell's the perfect coach. A team with 12 defensive players alone on the IR could have only pulled through this and clinched the number one seed with a head coach who's unapologetically alpha, a motivator that preaches grit and biting kneecaps. Sometimes the NFL messaging from coaches can seem a little cringy or cheesy, not to the players. There is a brotherhood and a masculinity that, I'll be honest, I like. People have been paralyzed playing this sport. Sometimes you just have to play through pain. You got to play hurt. And one guy in a locker room second-guessing the message can unravel the whole thing. In a way, it's like the anti-NBA league. You have to be selfless, and you have to play hurt every week. The Lions clinched a playoff spot on December 5th with all those injuries to seemingly the entire defensive roster. They could have packed it in. Let's get healthy. And nope, not with this team, not with this coach. They fought tooth and nail. Last week, everybody said that Niner game didn't mean anything. I totally disagreed. It was a chance to get backups, reps against Sam Darnold and the Vikings. The Detroit Lions are a symbol of so many things that are great about the NFL. Every game matters. Grit and toughness, which our society can always use, is really paramount. And again, unapologetically alpha. I mean, New England had the number one pick going into the weekend. They played themselves out of it. There is no tanking. Nobody will even consider it. And it's why the NFL remains king and separates from the rest of our professional sports. Dan Campbell, on a weekly basis, after winning, is almost in tears, preaching the message and his devotion to the city of Detroit and the Lions. This coach for this team in this time and this roster and this wacky season with currently 12 players on the IR defensively needed a completely unapologetic alpha, and the message to guys like me at the kneecaps at the podium, and I'm rolling my eyes. The players aren't. They totally bought into it. The number one seed. This is the Chicago Cubs in shoulder pads. That's what it feels like. The easiest dominant team. And go back to September, October, early November. It was like college. They were rolling people. But it is the easiest, most dominant physical team to root for I can remember. And here's the one guy, the one perfect fit after the win.
You guys look like you remember who the you are. Yeah, that was awesome. That's a hell of a win, guys. All I can think about is, man, we've been forged in this stuff now. This has been 3 years in the making. Some of it 4. Like, that just doesn't happen. You got to work through it, grind through it, and go through the downs to get to the ups of where we're at. That was unbelievable, man. Division winners, back-to-back seasons, and the number one seed.
If you're not from Detroit, you may not get it. You think it's a little cheesy. Oh, give me a break. But if you're from Detroit, you're a Lions fan, you're part of the culture, and you watch teams around this league. If you think this stuff's over the top, the Bears need that. The Titans need that. The Jaguars need that. The Chargers needed it and hired it. This is not a marketing campaign. This is completely, absolutely, authentically Dan Campbell, the perfect fit for this city and this team. All right, let's talk Sam Darnold. Oh, I know. Let me guess. You're all bailing on Sammy. Okay. So first of all, that was the biggest game in Detroit in probably 50 years. And there's an argument that the two best coordinators in the entire league both play for Detroit. Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn. And Detroit's got a better roster. And they got one of their defensive starters back. And this is a baby step league. And Sam Darnold looked juiced. He looked a little overwhelmed. He probably couldn't hear. He was inaccurate and high on all his passes. But across the field, Jared Goff's first big playoff game, and this did feel like a playoff game. I mean, it was the biggest game in Detroit in 5 decades. It felt like a playoff game. Mike Tirico was coming out of his suit. Jared Goff's first playoff game at home, 78 passer rating. Peyton Manning's first playoff game completed 45% of his throws. This has always been kind of a baby steps league. Last year at this time, Sam Darnold, who was viewed as a bust, was starting a meaningless game as a backup for the 49ers. And then there's yesterday. In the biggest game against arguably the best roster in the loudest field, you weren't winning that game. Minnesota was not winning that game. That's just one of those games. I looked at the playoffs this weekend. I looked at Denver at Buffalo. I love Sean Payton. That is a tough draw. There are games, a handful every year, where even a good team goes on the road and you're like, yeah, they're not going to win that game. That's a standalone game. This was the only NFL game that everybody was watching. Sam Darnold is just 27 years old. Now they go to Los Angeles. Their receiving core is a great matchup against the Rams' young secondary. Don't be shocked if the Rams draft a cornerback with their number one pick. They don't have a corner. They don't have a shutdown corner, and this is the deepest receiving core in the league, and it'll be 50% Viking fans, and my gut feeling is Minnesota's the play here. J-Mac disagrees. But it felt like a playoff game to me. It had that kind of feel. It was one of those, you don't get. The NFL is always entertaining, but there are a handful of games late in the season, and you're like, when the NFL schedules like Burrow and Mahomes in Week 17, and you're like, oh, that feels. I'll give you an example. The Steelers-Bengals on Saturday night felt like a playoff game. And that's a Saturday playoff game before a playoff game. And there's a reason restaurants have soft opens, right? Like you're not quite ready for the moment. I just don't think Sam and the Vikings, this young, fun team, were ready for the moment. And here's the coach after.
We didn't do a lot of the things that we've consistently done, all season long. And this game came down to, finishing in the red zone, weighty downs, third downs, pitching and catching. And we got to, find different ways to help guys get open. And when there are guys to potentially, throw and catch, we've got to be able to do that. We've done it at a very high level this year and just didn't really show up on the weighty downs.
Yep. Sam Darnold twice was high on Justin Jefferson throws. Absolutely. No question about it. You see this sometimes, first big games for quarterbacks, they look tight. I mean, that was the knock on Peyton Manning for years in the NFL, that he was a teeth clencher, that he was great and productive. He'd get into big games and he was too tight. And I thought Sam looked tight. But again, this was a guy that was a bust a year ago, that was starting for the Niners in Week 18 a year ago, to the biggest game in Detroit in 50 years. It wasn't going to be his night. I said last week, I like the Lions. They have the better roster. It's a bigger game. It means more. I know it's two 14-win teams playing for a number one seed. It just felt like Detroit's night. That's what it felt like to me. And you're saying, well, Colin, it's not a playoff game. It looked like it and felt like it to me. I'm watching Collinsworth and Mike Tirico, and those guys were bursting through the suits. That thing felt like the biggest game in a long time.